This is Metatherapy, where we talk about therapy itself. Not advice, not diagnosis, just understanding the process so you can use it better. Each episode of Metatherapy is psychoeducation, not therapy. If something resonates, it's meant to be language you can bring back into your own work. Think of something you know, really know, that you should be doing differently in your life. Maybe it's your phone scrolling. Maybe it's how you talk to yourself. Maybe it's a relationship dynamic you've named 100 times. Maybe it's something bigger. Stop drinking the way you've been drinking. Leave the job that makes you miserable. Reach out to a person you've been avoiding. You know, and yet, if knowing were enough, we'd all have figured out by now. And that's not a character flaw. That's not weakness. That's not failing at being a person. That is one of the most well-documented phenomenon in all psychological research. The gap between knowing and doing, between insight and change. And today I want to dig into why that gap exists and what actually closes it. This is the first episode in a 5-part series I'm calling When Insight Isn't Enough. Each episode explores one piece of the framework I've been developing, both for my own clinical practice and for a research presentation I'm giving at the APA annual convention this year. Over the next 5 weeks, we're going to cover why insight alone doesn't produce change, how the different parts of your inner world get in the way, what your nervous system has to do with any of this, and how change actually happens in the brain. And then we'll pull it all together into something you can actually use. It's a lot, but I think by the end of this series, some things will have felt confusing or frustrating about your own patterns are going to make a lot more sense. So let's start with what the research actually says. When psychotherapy works, and it does work, the evidence on that is solid. One of the things that's supposed to happen is that you gain insight. You understand yourself better. You see patterns you didn't see before. You connect your present behavior to your history, your childhood. You have those aha moments. And for a long time, that insight was treated as essentially the whole point. If you understood yourself, you'd change. That was the core assumption. A major 2018 meta-analysis looked at 23 studies and nearly 14,000 patients across and found insight does predict therapy outcomes, but only moderately and primarily in psychodynamic therapy. In other words, insight matters, but it's not the whole story. But here's what's even more interesting, and what I find myself coming back to with clients all the time. Researchers have found that there are actually 2 different kinds of insight that work completely differently in the brain and the body. Researchers distinguish between intellectual insight, the cognitive understanding of why you do what you do, and emotionally weighted insight, actually feeling the truth of something in your body, in your gut. Only the second kind reliably predicts behavior change. We all know people who have been in therapy for years, can explain their patterns in incredible detail, and haven't changed much. That's not a failure of therapy or the person. That's intellectual insight without emotionally weighted insight. The understanding is there. The felt sense shift just hasn't happened yet. And here's the thing that always gets me about this. The research gets even more counterintuitive. Some studies have found that heightened insight, particularly in depression, can actually worsen symptoms. When it becomes rumination, self-criticism, or hyper-awareness without any pathway forward. Insight without a corrective experience can become a trap. So this is why I want to be really careful here. I'm not saying insight is bad or therapy is useless or that understanding yourself doesn't matter, because it does. It absolutely does. What I'm saying is that insight on its own is necessary, but not sufficient in the beginning of the map, not the destination. So if knowing isn't enough, why not? What's actually getting in the way? I want to offer three answers to this question, three layers of why, and they build on one another. So let's begin with layer one. The relationship is the vehicle. The most robust finding in all psychotherapy research ever done, consistently replicated over decades of research, isn't about any particular technique or modality. It isn't about psychoanalysis or IFS or CBT or DBT. It's about the therapeutic relationship, what we call the therapeutic alliance. How much trust, agreement on goals, and emotional connection exists between the therapist and the client accounts for roughly 30% of therapy outcomes. Specific techniques like CBT and DBT, about 1% outcome variance in controlled studies. 1%. Not because technique doesn't matter, but because technique without a real relational container may not land the way we think it does. This is not anti technique talk. This is about what makes the technique work. What this tells us is that change, real change, happens relationally. It happens in the context of a safe, attuned connection where something new is possible. That's not fluffy or soft. That's what the data shows. So layer two is what I call you're not one person trying to change. This is the part where I find myself wanting to talk about all the time because it explains so much of this stuck feeling. When you say to yourself, I know I should set this boundary, I just can't seem to do it. What's happening isn't failure of willpower. What's happening is that one part of you does want to change, but another part of you is working very hard to keep things exactly as they are. Think about a pattern you've tried to change and couldn't. Notice that there's almost always a part of you that wants that change, and another part in that very same moment actually doesn't. Both of you both have reasons. The part that doesn't want the change isn't stupid or broken. It's usually the oldest, most protective part of you, doing a job it took on a long time ago. The protective part isn't listening to your intellectual insight. It has its own logic. It learned, often very early, that some version of saying staying stuck meant staying safe. And it doesn't update just because you've read the right book or had the right session. We'll go much deeper into this in episode 2. It's the whole focus of that episode, as a matter of fact. But the short version is this. The parts of us that maintain our stuck patterns are not irrational. They're just protective. They developed for very good reasons, and insight delivered to the conscious, rational mind often just doesn't reach them. Okay, so now we're at the third layer. And this one surprises people, is that a lot of what keeps us stuck isn't cognitive at all. It's not even psychological in the way we usually mean that word. It's physiological. Trauma and chronic stress are encoded subcortically, meaning below the level of conscious verbal processing. Talking about something, understanding something, narrating something may not access the body level memory where the pattern actually lives. When the nervous system has learned that a particular kind of situation means danger, even if your rational mind knows you're safe right now, your body can respond before your thoughts even have time to form. This is not a malfunction. This is your nervous system doing exactly what it was designed to do. The problem is that insight lives in the cortex, and a lot of what keeps us stuck lives in the body. We'll spend all of episode 3 on this. It's one of the most practically useful parts of the whole framework. Okay, so if insight isn't enough, what is? This is the hopeful part, because there are clear answers to this question, and the research is actually pretty coherent across different schools of therapy, even if they use different languages for it. So let's start with the corrective emotional experience. Back in 1946, two psychoanalysts, Franz Alexander and Thomas French, introduced a concept that I think is one of the most important ideas of all of psychotherapy. Alexander and French argued that intellectual insight alone is not sufficient for a lasting change. What the patient needs is a corrective emotional experience, a new emotional reality that directly contradicts the old one. This was an early explicit name of the insight change gap. So let's think about what that means in practice. It's not enough to understand what you learned to shut down emotionally because your feelings were dismissed as a child. You have to experience in your body in real time what it feels like to express a feeling and have it received, to be vulnerable and not be punished for it, to ask for something and not be rejected. That's not understanding. That's a new experience. And new experiences, it turns out, can actually update old learning in the brain. So, next, we're going to talk about memory reconsolidation, the neuroscience of why this works. Here's where the neuroscience gets genuinely fascinating. And this is where we're going to go entirely for the focus of episode 4. Research into memory reconsolidation shows that when an emotional memory is reactivated, it briefly enters an unstable state. And in that window, it can be permanently updated. The emotional learning isn't buried or suppressed, it's actually revived. Here's the plain language version of this: your brain doesn't just store memories like files in a cabinet, it updates them. Every time you remember something, you're rewriting it slightly, which means the right kind of experience at the right moment can change what a memory means to you at a very deep level. This is why certain therapy moments feel so different. Not like, oh, I understand something new, but like, gosh, something has changed. And here's the clinical implication: this kind of updating requires three things. First, reactivation. The old painful learning needs to be brought into the room, not just talked about. Two, a mismatch, a new experience that genuinely contradicts what the nervous system expected to happen. And three, repetition, enough repetition that the new learning consolidates into something durable. This is why real therapeutic change is rarely linear. It's rarely one big breakthrough moment and done. It's a process of reactivating, contradicting, and repeating until the new experience becomes the default. So, what does this all mean? Well, think about a moment in your own life. You may have had one where something you'd understood for years suddenly felt different. The same situation, the same pattern, the same trigger. But for some reason, in that moment, it didn't have you in the way it usually does. You had a beat distance, a glimpse of choice. And that wasn't insight. You'd had the insight for years. That was an experience. And experiences like that, when they're allowed to happen, when they're noticed and let in rather than rushed past, and how old learning starts to actually update. Maybe you've had a moment like that where something you'd understood for years suddenly felt different, landed differently. That's not coincidence. That's your nervous system actually updating. And that's where the real work happens. So, where does this all land? Over the course of this series, I'm building out what I'm calling the metatherapy framework, a way of understanding what gets in the way of change and in what actually moves the needle. Based on the research we've covered today and What we'll cover in the next 4 episodes, I want to give you a preview of the 4 pillars this framework rests on. One, relational safety, the therapeutic relationship as the container for all other change. Two, internal multiplicity, working with the parts of you that protect, that resist, and that hold the keys. Three, somatic awareness, the body's nervous system as the site where change is felt and made real. And then four is the experiential transformation, corrective experiences and memory reconsolidation as the mechanism of lasting change. These 4 things work together. You need the relationship for any of it to land. You need to understand the internal world, the parts, to know why you're stuck. You need your body to be regulated enough to actually shift. And then you need the actual experience, the moment where something genuinely different happens. Take any of these away, and you're working with only part of the picture. So here's what I want you to take away from today. If you've ever felt like you knew something, like really know it, and still can't seem to make the change you want to make, you are not broken. You are not failing. You are experiencing a real, documented, well understood phenomenon that every therapist in the world encounters, and that the best minds in psychology have been trying to understand for decades. The gap between insight and change is real, and it's closable. Next week, we're going to go into the inner world, the parts of you that are working very hard to keep things exactly as they are. And once you understand them, you'll probably feel more compassion for yourself than you ever have before. If this episode landed for you, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Specifically, where do you notice the gap in your own life between what you know and what you do? That question is actually a great thing to sit with this week and to ponder together. My name is Dominic Gadori, and this has been a special episode, first in a 5-part series of Metatherapy. I'll see you next week.